My name is Jessica Norwood, and I'm inspired to give I Believe in You money to folks that dare to dream bigger for themselves and communities. This is the kind of investment that signals love in action. Join me each episode as I talk to wisdom keepers, philanthropists, other investors, and entrepreneurs about investing in an economy that loves Black people. This is Believe in You money. And I've been calling this money that we do in the world believe in you money, the kind of money that shows up and believes in the possibility, that opens up access for imagination, that is also non-extractive. The gist of the chapter that you and I are going to be talking about, Brendan, is about risk, but really the whole paradigm of what people think is risk, right? So not just from an investment standpoint, but all of the psyche that goes behind, and the biases and all the stuff that goes inside of what you think is risky or not, and how you are moving and challenging those assumptions.
I mean, I started this, I work at Seed Commons, which is a provider of capital. We use as non-extractive terms, which we could unpack. And we provide capital not for the benefit of the capital provider, us or those who put a lot of money, but for the benefit of those who use it. We sometimes talk about, if you imagine the infrastructure of capital is like the infrastructure of water. And, we have like the reservoir, and it leads to all the pipes that go through the city and eventually get to your sink and you turn it on. And that's like, there's big piles of money, like a reservoir of money, and eventually there's a user of it. And in our system, all the infrastructure if you're getting the spigot out of your sink, every bit of infrastructure from where you get the water all the way back to the reservoir, everyone who works along the way, because that's a lot of people, it's financial intermediaries, they all work on behalf of making sure that the provider of money, in this case, the owner of the reservoir, gets as much back as possible. That's their goal. So their goal is they say to you, okay, you're going to get water from the sink. Okay, how much you can get back? All the infrastructure that's out there until the end, you get to the end user, all works on behalf of the provider of the resource money, not the recipient. And Seed Commons is an attempt to be infrastructure that doesn't work that way. So we can tap, maybe even if possible, tap the reservoir directly. We want to get higher and higher up to where the capital comes from, to tap that so we get the best terms for the borrower possible, because that's our job, is to make the capital as useful, fruitful, cheap and patient as possible for the borrowers. That's infrastructure. That's the abstract idea of what we are. What does that mean in practice? We're a cooperative network of 31 organizations around the country. We keep growing. Why are we in multiple places? We're cooperative of those organizations in those different places, so that the power distributes out to those organizations. They're all in, any organization that joins Seed Commons is in direct connection to their communities. They work and represent their communities, work in and represent their communities, and they place capital with local borrowers in non-extractive terms. We usually do it to worker cooperatives that involve as many workers as possible, sometimes other formations. So we have about $50 million in our loan fund. A lot of the work I've done is to raise money. So again, my job in the infrastructure, try to go farther up that plumbing to get as close to the reservoir as possible, get the resources as big and as cheap as possible for those borrowers. Out of that money, 93% has gone to borrowers of color, the majority of who are Black and Latinx, and 99% of the borrowers are low income. So that's what I've been doing. I've been building. I mean, I started, doing this in small scale in New York. Now I really work for, the organizations in the network that are in different parts of the country. They're actually the board, and they're my boss, and I'm one of the workers in what is now a 33-person team. 13 of them who work in the national team, and the rest who work in the local areas, distributing capital for the benefit of the borrowers.
It's so impressive. I mean, I didn't realize that you all had grown so much, Brendan. And I'm curious as to what you see as the reason, behind the growth. Like, what are people looking for when they're tapping into and saying, we want to be a member of Seed Commons, and we want to be a part of this non-extractive capital? What are community groups and folks on the ground thinking about when they're saying yes to something like this?
Well, I'd hope that what they're seeing is there's a real benefit it's better to work together than alone. You join, you get power. I mean, you join a community, but you also get power by doing it. I mean, if you're a new community organization that joins Seed Commons the first time, so you're new to Seed Commons, you can access capital at the exact same terms that the $50 million Seed Commons Fund accesses it. So you're joining a platform, but it's actually a platform also you own. Like people said, a lot of the tech platforms, well, they were useful at first until they got us hooked, and then all of a sudden they made it more difficult. They put more advertisements in, or they raised their prices or whatever. Well, that can't, and we said, well, it's too bad they're not cooperatively owned. It's too bad the users of the platforms don't own it, because then we could make sure that the more we got hooked, they didn't start to then use that to extract from us. And that's the case with Seed Commons. So if you join, the promise is you get to make sure that you're going to access that capital. You'll always have the right to keep access to the capital at the best terms we have. And capital, there's a lot we start to unpack about how capital works and the ways in which risk factors in, as you brought up in the beginning. But one of the ways it works is the bigger a pool of capital you have, the easier it is to get capital. Capital, money tracks money. Our first million was so infinitely harder to raise than $1 million now. And a new organization that joins, which may not be new at all in terms of what they do in their work. Hopefully, many organizations join us have been organized in their community for decades, and they're ready to support their community by supporting entrepreneurship and wealth creation. And they're looking to place capital now as like the next step in what they're doing. But there's the first time tapping money. To raise that first million for them would be extraordinarily hard, but if they join Seed Commons, they can in their first year, and they get it on the same terms that that we get it as a $50 million loan fund. So that's the first thing you'd see. I mean, our reason to be is to share access to capital, and it's like we say one of the metaphors used. It's all use the metaphor of plumbing. You also use the metaphor of a union. If you want to go and talk to your boss about a raise, if you go with every single worker behind you and said every single worker in this company says give Jessica a raise or else we're all walking, you're going to have a much better chance than if you just go alone. I mean, you can try to be really charming and see what, roll the dice with your boss, and some workers will pull that off if they do it on their own. But obviously most workers will not it's not a theory of change to think I'll charm our ways into raises. The same with charming our way into the capital markets. You go to the capital markets, some of us find benefactors, but finding a lucky benefactor is not a theory of change. We don't think. Whereas going to the capital markets in force altogether, if all the borrowers together go to the capital markets, we suddenly have people wanting to put money into our fund. So that's the way you can access money is already you're like, I'm part of a $50 million fund. We also share learning. We share three things: capital, learning, and then back-end services. So those other learning obviously matters an incredible amount. Supports you with your entrepreneurship projects, with your local ecosystem building, to do all the back-end work so that you are compliant with different governmental regulations. But really the reason for being is to change the equation of how people can access capital.
You talked about non-extractive capital, and we said we want to unpack that a little bit. I'm curious as to why non-extractive capital feels really essential to Seed Commons, and why is it even essential for Black, Brown, Latinx communities that you're working with? What's the marriage between the two thoughts in that?
There's a lot to unpack. I mean, in some ways, we even say Seed Commons we use the term non-extractive capital a lot, and yet it's not a great phrase. It's only defined as what it isn't. It's not extractive, but it's very evocative to people. It seems that people understand what extraction is. But it's not just about I'm a provider of capital. I could provide it to you extractively. Maybe I'll do it less extractively. It's not just about me being a bit more benevolent. It's really about changing the power structure, the power relationship, so that if you're a borrower, you get to use the capital for what is most beneficial to you. It's like right now, capital, generally corporations form around capital. You have capital formation. It's a pile of investors and other people. They form it, and then they hire human beings, workers. They just rent them essentially. Like the labor market, it's like renting people. And when they don't need them anymore, they stop renting them. Sorry, you're out. A worker cooperative is people forming together, saying, let's come together and start a business, and then renting capital. You pay, just like the corporation, which gets to rent people, has to pay them something, but they pay them the minimum they can. And then when they don't need them anymore, they stop paying them. What if workers could treat capital that way? What if workers could rent the capital, pay what they need to, But then when they don't need any more capital than they need, they stop. And they keep all the fruits for themselves, for their community. That's the way, that's a real change in the relationship of people and capital. Why does that matter so much, that non-extractive or that changed power relationship of people who use capital rather than capital using people? It's embedded in our history. I mean, that's a very abstract concept, but if you look throughout our history, capital being used as a force of domination is one of the most common strains of domination and of extraction. That's true of inside the United States, within communities, that Black and brown communities have been extracted from using capital a lot. Obviously, using debt, the amount of debt that is extracting from Black and brown communities today, the amount that it's being earned and then just goes away immediately to pay debts, is extraordinary. The amount that, and that's the flip side of the amount of capital that's not available to, I want to do something, I want to build a business. I can't access capital, or if I do, it's going to be on extremely extractive terms. And that's in the history. So the changing the power relationship of how we access capital, and that rather than capital naming the terms of entrepreneurship, of wealth creation, and saying, I'm going to extract the maximum possible, people get to name the terms and give as little as capital as possible. I mean, the story is also true on the global scale. I mean, it's reminded by, and this may be going off subject for you a little, but I know right now you've moved to Jamaica, and I went there a number of times with some people as part of a fellowship. And I was tasked with like researching the financial history of Jamaica. And on a global scale, I mean, Jamaica has owed so much debt, mostly to Britain, former colonial power, that it pays more on interest of its debt every year than it does on education or health combined. Imagine if a household did that. Say, well, we pay so much on our interest, we don't even get to go, send our kids to school or get medicine for our kids. But yet it's not because there's so much risk. Jamaica has paid its debt more than one time over. It's already paid, and yet it still owes more now than it does today. That extraction underlies our international relations like that. That is extraction, pure and simple. And that happens on an interpersonal scale. One person owes money for their credit card, or they're going to the hospital, their medical debts, or up on the global scale. So, and it sometimes is forgotten because it seems it's just accounting. It sounds like it's quiet and boring, but really those movements of capital and extractions from people, and they recapitulate all the power structures in our society. So people who are less powerful often are more extracted from. And when you get to like the United States of America and the way that the Black populations of our country have been treated since slavery, and since the exact same history of extraction tracks with the ways in which power has been used against Black populations and brown populations. The more less power you've had in our society, the more you've been extracted from, and often at the hands of capital. So reversing that relationship with capital is a first step towards changing the relationship people, and in our country, Black people have with the rest of the economy and society.
So what I'm hearing you talk about is that non-extractive capital is a way around which we're really striking this balance, and shifting the power dynamic. And that when we've had extractive capital, this has been the source of all of these sort of harms and things that have gone on. So if we're wanting to repair harms, partially part of that subject is really thinking about moving into a non-extractive capital and really shifting those power dynamics inside of that as well. And that makes so much sense to me. I'm thinking a little bit about also the part where you named, where if we all go together and talk to our boss about, we need this raise, or and how the group and community becomes even another way of striking a different dynamic around power as well. So there's the non-extractive part, but then there's also being in community and working together with one another. That brings, I think, a different level of complexion around power dynamics and resiliency and against exploitation. So how do you see things like community governance and community ownership? You've talked about cooperatives is as a foundational piece around how you're organizing this. But how does that then help us to even think about this disruption of power and risk? Because I would put two of them together, like that we think something is risky. And it's also very related to what the power dynamic is, who gets to think it's risky or not. So I'm curious, how does community governance and community ownership also help to think about power and risk?
It's funny, we talk about risk in finance, and everyone sort of knows we just mean risk to loss of wealth. For wealth, doesn't matter. There may be 100 people involved in, or 1,000 people involved in a new investment for a new factory, but it's just the owners of the capitals whose risk is considered of like, but what if they lose the money? What if it doesn't work and they put up millions of dollars? Even if it's one person who owned it, who owned that millions of dollars, and thousands of people whose job, the risk that we talk about in any financial endeavor like that is about the financial risk. It's just about the loss of assets. We don't talk about the risk to the planet, the risk to the people, the risk to society. And we abstract money things. So it's just about if money is lost, but really, but who owns the money? How much money? How much is it? Is it the same if, I lose $1 million, or, if 1,000 of us lose $1,000? One unpacking of this, and I think it might fit some of the really good framing you give, is it actually involves the concepts of sacred, because we say risk is about, well, what can we not lose? And dollars end up being what's sacred. Number one, we can't, everything has to work around dollars. People, if the preservation of capital is what matters most. And so, well, can we help that? Can we avoid bad impacts on the society, on people in the village that we're building a factory, and only if it doesn't cost more, rather than people being the sacred thing. Like, how are we going to do this investment? We can only do it in a way that it was going to most benefit the people, even if it costs more. Like that would be the equation you were doing, that the risk to destruction of the environment or of people, dollars don't mean anything if the planet's gone, if people are destroyed. The first problem with risk is that we without even meaning to, we only talk about dollars. And risk is about losing the human lives. It's about losing a young kid who could grow up and do something productive and creative and exciting for their community, and instead doesn't have a chance to do that, isn't given an opportunity, instead is given a polluted environment. That's risk, that's loss. It's loss of a planet. Dollars are just a means to get to the things we want. They are not the ends, but they become so in our risk evaluations.
What's the risk that we face by not making the investments?
We risk everything. I mean, we risk our future of a livable planet. We risk the lives of all those people who are trapped in communities where the only economic opportunity they have is to try to find a job for someone else. There's no capital available to them to build their own wealth creation. Their talents are so often underutilized is too much of an understatement. They are just 99% of the human potential gets lost and wasted because the resources are kept from them. The resources are kept in just a few hands. When the risk is, when our resource is so concentrated in a few people, the risk is just to those people. The idea of the invisible hand when it comes to investment is, well, people, if they have investment dollars, they'll invest in factories and give us jobs. And sometimes that happens. Sometimes there's positive externalities for the rest of us, but very often there's not. I mean, investors, when they look at, was it better if I upgrade this factory, say in Michigan, or if I just close it and let it go? And that choice, if their financial advisors do the math and they say, we might make a couple more dollars to leave. But that's not actually true society-wide, that even the dollars will be lost. The amount of dollars lost because of us abandoning the economic production in the car industry in Michigan, which I keep using the example, was astronomically more. We lost so much dollars societally-wise. But the investors, they don't see all the losses of jobs to the thousands and thousands of workers. They don't see the losses of potential earnings to the thousands and thousands of children of those workers, those communities that fall into pure blight that happened in Michigan after the departure of the auto industry. They don't see any of that. They just see their own portfolio. And when we allow our economic decisions of investments society-wide to be made by people whose portfolio ends where their own bank account ends, we are at extraordinary risk of all the rest of society's potential, whether it's about a clean future, about a future where all children have the opportunity to flourish, where communities that have been built have an opportunity to maintain themselves and continue investing in themselves rather than be abandoned. Those risks are, when you actually put them on a piece of paper and compare them to dollars, it's obvious to almost anyone. Common sense says there's no way we should be choosing dollars, and yet we do time after time. It's everything we care about, really. You know, the financial equation of saying, well, which will make more dollars for my investor? It says, take all your other values, all the things. What about the children in that community? What about the things that have already been built, the community relationships that were built around these auto, industry jobs, and like the history of the Great Migration and the first middle-class Black jobs that happened in the United States, and abandoning this entire, what about the cities that were created in this country? Just abandoning all of those things. As making an investment decision, you're supposed to ignore all of those things, all of those values, and just decide what's going to make more dollars for my client. It's sociopathic what you were supposed to do. You are supposed to ignore all the impacts on society. So we risk making all the wrong decisions by letting private financial gain be what guides the investments we make in our country for tomorrow.
I want to talk about what it looks like if we invested in an economy that loves Black people. Like, what do you see as this beautiful outcomes? How do we become as people? How does the world become if we got it into our hearts and our minds and our practice to invest in an economy that loves Blackness, that loves Blackness? Yeah.
John Rawls was a writer, wrote then about this idea of, well, a society should be where if you didn't know who you're going to end up as, if you were like, you're going to be placed in society, you don't know where you're going to be, how do you want that society to be? And we talk about frontline communities as being, they're the communities that are most impacted, say, by environmental injustice. And if they were made, we say we should think about what would it take to save frontline communities, because if they're saved, then the rest is going to be saved too. And in our country, in the United States, Black Americans have been essentially like the frontline people for so long with Native Americans, and of getting the treatment that our economy, it's so many markers at the worst kind of treatment there is. So if you made on a society which said the worst off would be an okay place to be, that sort of veil of ignorance is a starting place a lot look at. So I think I'd immediately say, we can't have anyone who's treated as badly as our country right now has historically and continues to treat Black Americans. Extractive investment would have to be gone. Right now, our economy is based around privileging. So if you were a kid growing up, in a mostly Black city like Flint, Michigan, rather than saying, my municipality can't even provide me safe drinking water, instead you'd provide the resources, capital will be available to you to go to school, to get health, and to get healthcare, and to start a business even with your friends, to invest in a real just society, to buy your own piece of Ford Motor Company, that the workers in that town who helped build that company would have allowed to own their own piece of it. And that sounds like a crazy world. That is the world that Mondragon in Spain and Emilia-Romagna in Northern Italy built, where everyone who was a citizen there would have access to the capital to buy a piece of their company. They didn't have to just go to a company and say, would you hire me? There's another framework now, which is not with the veil of ignorance, is with awareness of the real history and who's treated how. And the framework of reparations, of saying, let's actively approach, like, we know who's been treated worse. The math is really clear. The statistics are too glaringly clear. So let's actively do things to repair for damage done. This was said by Ed Whitfield, who I work with. Said I'm cribbing from something he said as a Seed Commons response, but that when the representatives of the newly freed African American community got together and said what we would want would be 40 acres and a mule, they're very aware of it being productive capital, not consumer goods, of that being a way of achieving economic independence. At the time, it's not. Now it would be something different, but to have something that's economic independence, not just a consumer good. So it's not a one-time check, but changing the equation of economic power, changing the way that our society distributes abundance and wealth creation, that's real reparations.
What are some of your favorite examples of investing in Black joy?
The group of workers who started New Era Windows, which is actually the factory you see pictured behind me. And New Era Windows was all Black and Latinx Americans who started it 100%, who would work together in a union and as part of this whole factory, and they came together to start it. And I got to know the workers really well. I'd spend all day, it was the project I had worked the most on personally. So I'd spend every day, all day in the factory a lot. So I got to know workers really well and became good friends with many. Some of the Black workers that were there talked about what it meant to become owners. Now, Ricky Macklin is one who, if you were lucky enough to search him on the internet, he was very good at expressing himself. So he's someone who could capture really well what it meant to be a worker owner. He talked about, he used the story of the elephant. He said he went to the circus when he was a kid and he saw the elephant had this tiny little stake in the ground that was holding this giant elephant. And he said, Dad, how does that work? How does that little stake? He said, oh, well, they do that. They put the stake on when the elephant's still a kid and can't pull it out. And the elephant just learns, oh, I'm stuck here. And so it just works because it really is around their minds. And he said, and that's what it's like growing up poor, growing up Black, growing up as a worker in America. We assume we have no power. We think we have to just do what the boss says. We have no power. And it's true materially, and it also becomes true psychologically for us. And they fought really hard to take this factory over. They fought against the boss who tried to fire them without giving them their severance pay that they were contractually obliged to. They fought to then form a cooperative. So they had to do a lot of taking it wasn't handed to them. But he talked about them what it was like to become an owner and feeling that chain lifted for what it was possible to be. And he said when he told this story the most recent time he told it, he talked about how he knew his grandkids were watching, and that's what he thought about when he would speak to the camera. Because you can find him in being interviewed on the internet. And he said, I know that they're watching, and I want them to know that you're going to feel like you have less power than you do. You'll have to take it. It's not going to be given to you, but they're going to the chains they put around your ankles are going to try to be chains around your mind as well. And you're going to believe you're not capable of things that you are capable of. That was really powerful. And his buddy, whose name was Poppin, William Swanson, but he went by Poppin, and supposedly it's because when he showed up at the party, it would start popping. It's an old story, but that's what he went by for many, many years. That was when he was a kid. And at one point he got a letter. We got a letter in the mail. We were sitting around New Era. It was after work. We were kind of hanging out. It was like 5 o'clock. I don't know. We were sitting around, and he got a letter, and it was written to the owners, and it was written to him. He realized, and it was written to him, and he said, and he suddenly got these chills. He said, "Oh my God, I realized that's me." We'd been at that point. He'd been, we'd had the factory been there for a while, but he still got this. Oh yeah, holy, like I'm an owner. And he said it was like, he said, you know how you can get, like, if you're in church, you get the Holy Ghost. He said, I just got the owner ghost. Like that was like, I just felt it go through me, the owner ghost. And we would reference the owner ghost after that for a long time, because that was this joy that he felt. Yeah, and knowing the real, the people that actually was there. I got the privilege of getting to know folks and hearing their life stories that would blow anybody away of what obstacles they overcame to achieve what they had, and just some of the best, most fun people that I got to spend time with. And we had a lot of joy, and they had a lot of joy becoming owners of their own company.
I think the kind of resources that you put into New Era and what you do with Seed Commons is believe in you money. And it's like, I believe in you. I believe in what you can create. Why I believe that you are useful and important to us, to me, to this community, to your family. And that's the kind of resources that we want to put out there. We want resources that articulate that and make that really present and felt for folks, that we believe in what you're doing, what you're making, and what your contributions will be for all of us. And so I wonder, what's a personal story of when you have received some believe in you money? Who's believed in you and supported this beautiful vision in the world?
It would be when when I was working with the workers of New Era, when we started New Era, we went around shopping for that money. There was a lot of a lot of enthusiasm, or it was kind of known what was happening. There was some amount of mean, when New Era was first occupied by its workers, it wasn't New Era yet, it was Public Windows and Doors in 2008. It was right after the banks had been bailed out. It was big enough news that then presidential candidate Barack Obama had to talk about it. His adversary, John McCain, had to talk about it. George W. Bush had to talk about it. Like, Republic Windows and Doors and the sit-in strike these workers did was on the news. One of the Fox News anchors, who probably got fired after this, said that the workers were heroes for doing what they did. It was in the news. They had their moment. There's pictures of Armando Robles, who's one of the people who helped really push forward New Era, with Joe Biden at his side at the factory, because after they helped succeed, he was then vice president. He got sent to go and talk about opening a new factory. But then everyone left, actually. But a lot of people were excited about New Era, but weren't ready to put down money. And I went around and shopped around for money. And there were some people who put up money initially. Now we have a $50 million fund. Like I said, now we want to raise $1 million. An investor is just 1 out of 50. That's no big deal. It's really hard to be the first investor who has one project that's for a worker cooperative of workers who never done it before. So by believing in the story I was selling, and in the workers who were that story, so I can't really I can't separate believing in me from believing in New Era. But those people, they did that. We fought hard, and that happened. The first people who put money in, and we got the money at the last minute, just in time. I mean, it was, and we got enough money to buy that factory that had gone bankrupt out of auction. The workers got to do it. That was an example to create New Era Windows. That was believe in us money.
What's your advice for somebody who's considering using their money to build this economy that loves Black people? What actions would you advise for them to take on that journey?
Risk capital is what is missing. And I said this recently at a conference, that if you want to think, this was to foundations, but the same thing would apply. How do we put our money in that's not the give a kid a fish money, it's the teach a kid a fish money? It's the thing, it's risk capital is what is needed to help create productive assets and distribute productive assets among people.
You did it. Thank you. Beautiful, beautiful interview. I'm excited. You've dropped some real gems. I mean, the risk is about what we can't lose. That'll be on loop in my brain for forever. Thank you, brother, so much for contributing so beautifully to the world and to this project. It is going to be felt. Thank you.